The Observer.
William has been captivating readers for more than 40 years, whether through the early novels drawing on his childhood in West Africa, his epic whole-life narratives such as Any Human Heart, the audacious art world hoax of Nat Tate, or the thrilling spy fiction streak that has given us Restless, the James Bond novel Solo, and now The Predicament, the second in a trilogy starring the travel writer and accidental spy Gabriel Dax. Set in the turbulent Cold War years of the early 60s, it's the story of desire, deception, chance, and fate, belonging to that great literary subgenre described by William Boyd as young chap gets in a pickle. There's lots I want to ask William about: his gift for time travel, his affinity for the secret world of espionage, and of course the narrative arc of his own remarkable writing life. But we definitely want to hear from you too, so there'll be plenty of time for audience questions in the second half of the event. But first, William, I would love it if you would treat us to a little excerpt from The Predicament.
I'm going to read from the very beginning, so there's no real need to set up. Gabriel Dax is a travel writer, quite a successful young travel writer in his 30s, 3 or 4 books to his name, but he's been inveigled into working for MI6 by his brother, and then by this mysteriously alluring handler, Faith Green. And he is not very happy, but once in, as Faith Green says to him, nobody quits in this job. So he's stuck. I don't think I need to say anything more because it would take me too long to explain. So I think this will give you a hint of what's going on in his life. He's living in East Sussex in a village called Claverley. I invented, in fact, I've used it in 3 or 4 novels, so don't Google map it. He's moved out of London and he's living in the country in a small village. Gabriel Dax looked out of his kitchen window over his back garden and saw the fox slink along the foot of the beech hedge. It was moving almost daintily, its dense brush holding a steady horizontal line. He noted the rich amber of its fur offset by the dark brown of the near leafless hedge. The fox paused for a moment, as if to allow Gabriel to register the perfect juxtaposition, and turned its sharp head to stare directly at him, with animal clarity, or so it seemed. Then it slipped through a gap and disappeared into the small oak wood that lay beyond the garden's border. Gabriel felt a sudden whelm of apprehension and shivered. Was that a good omen or an evil one, he wondered. He was still troubled by last night's unwelcome phone call that he had received from his contact at the Russian embassy, Natalia Arkadina. She had requested a meeting today at the familiar place, the Café Matisse on the King's Road in Chelsea. He could hardly say no, given that the money Natalia and the KGB supplied him with had, to a large degree, allowed him to purchase his new home, this solid old Victorian cottage on the outskirts of Claverley in East Sussex. Hang on. He stepped out through the kitchen door and wandered moodily into his garden. It was early and chilly, but there had been no frost. A heavy dew spangled on the lawn, and there was a blear, sulphurous morning light in the air, almost as if it were about to snow. He knew why he felt troubled, jangled somewhat. Natalia Arkadina's telephone call reminded him of his other unsought-for parallel existence, his life in the shadowy fringes of the espionage world. Try as he might, he couldn't pretend it didn't exist. What had Faith Green said to him when he tried to quit, tried to tell her that his connection with MI6 and the Institute of Developmental Studies was terminated? Nobody quits in this business, Gabriel. You know that. Yes, he thought bitterly. And now the fucking Russians are on board.
Thank you, William. I wanted to start by asking you what it is about the genre of spy fiction that keeps pulling you back in.
Well, it's not just me. It's the remarkable thing, particularly our literature, British and Irish literature. It goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, to Joseph Conrad with his 1909 novel, I think, The Secret Agent. And then he wrote another spy novel called Under Western Eyes. And from that example, I think a lot of literary novelists have tackled the genre. I mean, Somerset Maugham, John Buchan, Graham Greene, Elizabeth Bowen, Muriel Spark, and when you come to my contemporaries, Ian McEwan, John Banville, Helen Dunmore, it's me. There's an extraordinary attraction to this genre as opposed to other genres, crime or horror or science fiction or romantasy, whatever. And my theory is that the reason that why novelists like me and all these other people I've mentioned are drawn to the world of espionage is that actually it's remarkably similar to our lives, the human condition, this strange adventure we're all on. Because if you think about it, we've all been betrayed, and we've all betrayed people. We've all lied, admit it, and been lied to, and we all change our identity subtly or dramatically as the situation demands. If you're wooing someone or trying to impress a future employer, we subtly adapt our persona to fit that occasion. And these are things that spies do. And so my theory is that when you, the reader, read a spy novel, it's not a strange world, paradoxically. It's actually a very familiar world, because you are familiar with all the emotions and all the tropes that the spy novel employs. And I think that's why I write spy novels, because you get your cake and eat it. You can write something exciting and compelling, but you can also write a novel that deals with the matter that an ordinary novel deals with, human emotions, human dilemmas, tragedies, comedies, and so on. It's a very all-embracing genre.
There's also that sense of not just what other people are hiding from you, but perhaps what you might be hiding from yourself, isn't there? There was that Le Carré quote, which I think you may have cited once or twice: "We hardly know ourselves. 9/10 of ourselves are below the level of the water."
Well, that might have been true about John Le Carré. Now we know a lot more about his life. But yes, I think that's true. And I think that all my spies, in fact, in my spy novels, have been reluctant or accidental spies. So, I don't know anything about the bureaucracy of MI5 or MI6. I've read lots of books, but Le Carré was a professional spook, as was Graham Greene. So they knew how the organization worked. So almost perforce, I have to have spies that are like me, somebody who blunders into that world and doesn't really understand what's going on, or tries to understand, tries to second guess, tries to figure out what the particular machinations of this complicated, potentially lethal game that's being played. And so it's as Gabriel Dax gets more and more embroiled, the reader knows as much as he does. And so it becomes quite an engaging journey. But Le Carré, for example, writes often omnisciently, and so you dot between different characters and different people within the circus, as he called it. But I couldn't do that because I just don't know enough about it. So all my spies will be reluctant and dragged down by the quicksand.
That's true. It applies to all your characters who've got involved in the world of espionage, doesn't it? Dating back to any human art.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, Logan, that's where it all started, because the protagonist, Logan Mount Stewart, is recruited to the Naval Intelligence Division in World War II by none other than Ian Fleming himself. And Logan becomes a spy and is actually parachuted into Switzerland on a mission and is arrested 24 hours later. So he's a very unsuccessful spy and spends the rest of the war fulminating and trying to figure out who had betrayed him. But that got me very interested in the psychology of spying and spies, and also what price you pay when you enter that world. And I was particularly drawn by the character of Kim Philby, the super spy, 23 years at the heart of MI6, a double agent for the Soviets. It's extraordinary how he survived, even though he was often exposed at least twice. But he was, there are lots of various explanations as to why or how, but what's fascinating is how could he live with that pressure? I mean, his wives didn't know he was a Soviet double agent. Everybody loved Kim. What a great chap, and it was an amazing act of duplicity. And so that's what started me getting interested in that world. And then I thought, well, maybe I should write a proper spy novel myself. And I wrote Restless, which is about spying in the USA in World War II, something nobody knows very much about, or didn't until I wrote about it. There's a Kim Philby figure in it, and I imagined, what if Philby hadn't defected, a bit like Anthony Blunt, who was pardoned, and Sir Anthony Blunt, keeper of the Queen's Pictures, was a Soviet double agent, for God's sake. We do certain things very well in this country, dictionaries, bespoke tailoring, and we were very good at betraying our country as well. So that stimulated my interest, and it's carried on ever since.
So it has quite a long lineage in terms of your work. But this particular, as I mentioned, this is second in a trilogy, and this particular sequence of novels had a slightly unusual genesis, didn't it? Will you tell us something of how it came about?
Yes, Restless was a great success as a novel, and it was turned into a BBC miniseries, which had a fantastic cast. I wrote the scripts, and it was very successful. And I was approached by the then drama commissioner, because Restless had been so successful. They said, will you have an open door at the BBC? Could you write us a Cold War spy thriller, 6 episodes? Yes, with pleasure. So I did. I wrote the pilot, and I developed this series, which again featured a travel writer. It wasn't called Gabriel Dax, but a travel writer who becomes a reluctant spy. And I did a lot of research, and I wrote outlines for the other 5 episodes, but never trust a BBC commissioning editor is my motto. There was some complex maneuverings going on, and after I'd been to the sort of 70th meeting, I realized that actually it wasn't going to be made, and I refused to go to any more meetings, and sure enough, the whole thing foundered. But I'd done all this work, cut to 10 years later, and I'd finished my big novel, The Romantic, which covers a great swathe of the 19th century. And I thought I'd have to do something a bit more concentrated and fun, maybe. And so I thought, I'll sod the BBC. I'll revive my spy thriller and turn it into a trilogy. So I'd done all the work, and as I wrote the first book, Gabriel's Moon, I realized there was enough material to carry on for at least 3. I'm nearly finished 3, actually, as we talk. It'll be out this time next year. 3 books, 3 years, never again. But I think readers will be pleased. And actually, it'd be like writing a 750-page novel, as I was saying earlier on. So that's its genesis. The research I did for this series, there may be more Gabriel Dax novels further down the line may keep me going in my dotage, for all you know. So they're great fun to write, and the 60s and the Cold War is a great arena for a spy novel to take place in, because it's analog spying. You know, there's no GPS satellite tracking, there's no internet, no mobile phones. If you want to make a phone call, you have to find a phone box. Remember those days? There's, you know, it's just like old-fashioned agent in the field spying, and that's the classic spy novel, it seems to me. Whereas today, spying is all about surveillance or listening or whistleblowing. It's not about could you deliver this package to that mysterious man in Belgrade? You know, so it's not as much fun.
And the other thing about setting these books in this particular moment in the 60s, of course, is that it's this extraordinarily turbulent sort of geopolitical time, and you have. I want to come on to this. I want to come on to the specifics, without giving any spoilers, the specifics of some of the events in this book, but just more generally across the two books, this is, you know, it's a period of, you've got Guatemala, you've got the Bay of Pigs, you've got Iran in 1953. The 50s and 60s saw several sort of CIA-backed coups, successful or otherwise. Was that part of the appeal of situating it in this particular moment?
Yes, it was. I mean, I sort of do that anyway in all my novels, and I want, I'm a realistic novelist, and I want the world of my novels and the characters that populate that world to be as authentic and as plausible as possible. And one of the ways I bring this about is by introducing real historical events or real people into the novel. So in Gabriel's Moon, the initial event is the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo in 1961, which I actually remember, believe it or not. I was only 9 years old, but Lumumba was a heroic figure in Ghana, where I was living at the time, and people were talking about him. So I remember that. But it was a blatant act of regime change engineered by the CIA, MI6, and the Belgian Secret Service. They thought, because Lumumba was inviting Russians and Russian troops in the country, they were going to have Cuba in Africa. And of course, in the Congo, there was amazing supplies of uranium. The Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs were made with Congolese uranium. And so Eisenhower just said, let's get rid of this guy. And it was called Operation Viking. They were going to plant poisoned toothpaste in his bathroom. The Cold War, it's just beat that. But they did have him arrested and executed by firing squad, and then they melted his body down by sulfuric acid. And Gabriel Dax is the last man to interview Lumumba before this happens. And so the ramifications of that affect the rest of the novel, but there is the Cuban Missile Crisis as well, and in the Predicament, he goes to Guatemala. Again, it's real events, a military coup, again engineered by CIA. In fact, it was Kennedy who authorized that coup. They didn't like the military guy who was leading the country, so they orchestrated a coup to replace him, because United Fruit Company were unhappy about prospects of giving land back to the peasants. But it was a kind of mad hegemony that existed in those days, that we don't like this person, we don't like this regime, well, let's change it, So maybe plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. When you see what's going to happen in Venezuela, but it's very interesting to go back to the 60s and see how that power was just wielded, unconditionally.
And there's again, no spoilers, but it's we felt we were safe to talk about this because it's mentioned in the blurb of the book if you haven't already read it. But there's a very famous assassination that is sort of in in the backdrop to this novel. But can you tell us a little bit about the JFK story and what drew you to that, and why you decided to bring that into Gabriel's orbit?
Yes, he's. It's not a surprise because it's highlight in the blurb that after Guatemala, Gabriel goes to Berlin because there's a visit by President Kennedy, and in June 1963 is the moment when he did his famous "Ich bin ein Berliner" speech, and there's a genuine risk that he might be assassinated, and it's a little known fact, but there were two foiled assassination attempts on Kennedy's life before Dallas, one in Miami, one in Los Angeles. So I just imagined there might be one in Berlin. But anyway, as you say, the backdrop is that Kennedy was assassinated, and I'm a bit of a Kennedy conspiracy theorist. Because if anybody with functioning eyesight should be a conspiracy theorist, in my opinion, because if any of you have ever seen the famous Zapruder film, that little home movie that was taken of the moment that Kennedy was shot by somebody standing on the side of the road, it's completely apparent that the third shot, which hit Kennedy in the throat and blew the back of his head off, comes from in front of the motorcade. But Oswald was behind the motorcade. So that means there were at least two shooters. Therefore, there must have been a conspiracy. But who conspired is where it all gets a bit hazy and nuts sometimes. But I have a theory, which I outline in the book, which seems to me very plausible, but that I think there can be no doubt that there was a conspiracy, and a successful conspiracy, to kill Kennedy, but who did it and precisely why remains vague or arguable. So many odd things surround the assassination. The way Jack Ruby was able to get into the police station and shoot Oswald, the fact that Kennedy's brain is missing, key evidence. There's a book written by a young medical intern who was at the autopsy, said the room was full of men in suits. Who were they? What were they doing? And Bobby Kennedy said that the Warren report, which targeted, no pun intended, which fingered Oswald as the lone gunman, was the biggest act of work of fiction ever presented to the American public. So the whole penumbra around that killing is highly dubious. But I'm convinced it was conspiracy, but you have to read the book to find out who I think did it.
There's conspiracy, there's also chance and fate and luck, and Faith Green, Gabriel's handler, says at one point, history is the history of unintended consequences. Life is random, unpredictable. This feels like something of a through line in your fiction, which often sees characters sort of buffeted about by forces beyond their control.
Aren't we all? You know, it's yes, it is a big theme of mine. It's this idea that your life is all about the good luck you have and the bad luck you have. And if you look back at your life, you can see those moments of bad luck and those moments of good luck, and usually the two piles sort of match up. But if you see life like that, I think it's actually quite empowering, because it means that if that old line, if you want to make the gods laugh, tell them your plans, is very valid. And if you think life is random and history is a history of unintended consequences, then what it makes you do as a person, I think, is appreciate the present moment, and your present happiness, such as it is an incredibly fragile thing. So savor it, because tomorrow it could be shattered. And so if you advance forward with this sort of due caution, with this sort of makeshift philosophy in mind, you actually, I think, can enjoy the life you're leading, and see what tomorrow brings, because it may be something you don't expect at all. And so in the case of Gabriel Dax and the jeopardy he finds himself in as a spy, it's all the more relevant. But it applies to us all. Again, the spy novel holds up a mirror to our own lives.
Well, although he's under enormous pressure at times, he does have time to enjoy life as he goes along. I mean, he drinks well, he eats well. You know, he has quite a lot of sex as he goes through it. I was thinking about your resolve that you wanted to write something fun. I was thinking, actually, it must have been enormous fun to see Gabriel through all those situations that he finds himself in.
Yes, it's true. I mean, I called it a spy novel with extras, because he is a writer after all, and he is trying desperately to keep his ordinary life on track while he gets more and more embroiled in his secret life. But one forgets, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the 60s well, because they sort of coincided with my teenage years. But everybody smoked, and everybody drank booze, and nobody cared what they ate. So unlike today, I mean, my father was a doctor, and he smoked, and he had 2 large gins at lunchtime, and I think he drank a bottle of whiskey every night. He died when he was 58. Maybe that explains it, but it was normal, you know. And if you look at any film, you know, any film noir set in the 30s, the 40s, everybody is smoking non-stop, men and women. I watched a Rock Hudson movie, black and white Rock Hudson movie, and there wasn't a single scene where Rock Hudson wasn't smoking. So people say to me, surely nobody drank as much as that or smoked, but of course they did in the 60s. It's quite extraordinary. So it's a bit of realism, a bit of time travel that, again, it's fun to travel back in time and imagine a world, you know, like the world we live in, of course, but with all the things we take for granted now not being there. You know, sending postcards to people. Hello, how quaint. So it's fun to do that and to imagine how people travelled from A to B, what they had for breakfast, you know, all that sort of thing. Again, in the interest of making this realistic novel as realistic as possible.
Talking of the realism and the texture of the book, there's a terrific scene in Guatemala City, I think, where Gabriel's enjoying a nice dinner in a hotel, and there's this sort of burst of machine gun fire outside, and then everyone sort of pauses and then goes back to their pudding. And I thought you're brilliant at evoking that sense of life sort of continuing in proximity to kind of shocking or violent events. I wondered what you draw on to capture that so vividly, and whether you could tell us a bit about your own upbringing in Africa, and I know partly that was a time of violence in where you were living in West Africa.
Yes, I mean, I'm sort of basically try to imagine what it would be like, and often if you let your imagination loose, it's surprising me how close to the truth, whatever that is. But I think this feeling partly came about from living in Nigeria in the late 1960s, when I was in my late teens. And the Nigerian Civil War was raging. Mind you, I'd also had 3 military coups before the war started, so it was a crazy time in Nigeria. And of course, when you're an adolescent, it sort of seems amazing rather than terrifying. My parents weren't having such as many laughs as I was, but odd things happened to me. I remember coming, because I was at boarding school, and I would fly back to Nigeria in the holidays, and I remember landing at Lagos airport and being taken aside by some soldiers and walked down a corridor and put in a room, and they said, take all your clothes off. And I thought, what? By the time I got down to my Y fronts, I think they realised that I wasn't smuggling currency or drugs or anything like that, and they said, you can go now.
How old would you have been?
I've been 17 or 18.
Right.
And then there was another famous incident which I've written about in the past where, because of this currency smuggling that was going on during the war, there were roadblocks everywhere. And so you'd just be driving along and you'd be stopped and out of the car. And I was learning to drive at the time, and my father actually never succeeded in driving, but anyway, my father would take me out to the distant roads of the campus of the university we lived in Ibadan in western Nigeria, and teach me the rudiments of driving. And we were driving back at dusk one night on back roads, and we drove through a roadblock by mistake. It was just a plank and an oil drum. And my father jammed on the brakes, and 6 soldiers ran out of the bush, completely drunk, with their AK-47s levelled, and ordered us out of the car. And I remember vividly thinking, this could all go terribly wrong. But my father, who was a kind of a doctor and a revered figure there, turned on them and said, call that a roadblock. You should be ashamed of yourselves. And he completely diffused this awful moment. But for a while, anything could have happened. And then they let us, they searched the car and they let us drive on. But I mean, it stayed with me. And again, that sense of good luck, bad luck, fragility, it could have been an awful moment had they suspected we were driving through the roadblock. They could have just opened fire on us. And it stayed with me. And again, all the events of the Biafran War, which was a surreal, weird war. I mean, 1 million people died, but I've written about it in Any Human Heart. There's a whole chapter about it. But you'd see the most awful newsreels on Nigerian television every night as the Federal Army advanced into the heartland of Biafra. There was no censorship at all, and you're sort of watching it. It's like watching the Ukraine war on these video channels, but it was just broadcast to the Nigerian population. And I realised that warfare and conflict was nothing like the movies, and it had a profound effect on me. And I turned that realisation into my second novel, An Ice Cream War, which is about another African war, but the First World War in East Africa. But everything I'd seen and understood about the Biafran War went into that novel, and I'm sure it's shaped my thinking ever since.
I wonder how that period's shaped your sort of sense of home as well, because that seems I suppose when you're that age, any situation you're in is normal because you don't know any different. But it seems an extraordinary thing to be growing up in Nigeria and then off to boarding school in Scotland. You're in boarding school in Scotland, and coming backwards and forwards. And did either of those feel like home to you at the time?
Well, I think I always felt that West Africa was my home. Yeah. That's where my family home was, my room was, all my stuff was, and I sometimes referred to myself unreflectingly as West African. And the UK and Scotland was a familiar place, but I was more at home in Ibadan, Western Nigeria, than I was in Edinburgh. I knew how Ibadan worked in a way that I didn't know how Edinburgh worked. And being at a single-sex boarding school is not normal life, I can assure you. And so my normal life, in a way, took place in the holidays, and the contrast between the two worlds I shuttled between was very strong. I'm sure, again, that experience, which was common to all colonial children in those days, you could have a primary education in Africa, but you couldn't have a secondary education, really, particularly when I was growing up. It got better later on, but so you had to be sent away, and that was another strange experience that I've written about a lot, and I'm sure I was at this particular boarding school, Gordonston, for nearly 10 years, and I had to re-educate myself when I left. Didn't have a particularly bad time, but it was a strange hothouse society. So very odd, the kind of freedoms of living in West Africa, which was extraordinary because it was totally unsegregated. It was, as a white child, I could go anywhere, anytime, fearlessly. I would go and see a movie at midnight in the middle of Ibadan, and I'd get in a Volkswagen bus with other people and just travel there, and never felt threatened, never felt worried. So that was extraordinary. It wouldn't happen today, but at the time, and we had Nigerian friends, Ghanaian friends, and you'd go to a tennis club. It was completely mixed. So it was growing up in I was obviously a minority, privileged white minority, but it wasn't like living in Kenya or the then Rhodesia, let alone South Africa. It was living in a totally integrated African country. And so I had that freedom and liberation, and then was back to the hothouse society in the north of Scotland.
I was going to say, it sounds like there may have been more of a sense of threat at Gordonston than back home. Was King Charles was king? Our king was.
Yes.
Were you there at the same time?
We overlapped. He's older than me, but I remember him. He doesn't remember me. I have spoken to him about it, and he had. I don't think it's any secret. He didn't enjoy his school years, but it was, and he was. I think in the early days, quite seriously bullied, but. He was a figure present in the school. He became head boy, of course. Surprise, surprise. But
that must have been a very difficult decision for the head, mustn't it? Yeah.
But and I think his last year was he enjoyed it more, but he didn't have a happy time there. But I had a perfectly okay time. It was a very austere place to live in when I think back at it and think of the conditions we lived in. But it was a kind of democratic school. It wasn't hierarchical, and so it was tolerable. And if you were good at games, it was slightly more tolerable. But it was a very curious institution, and I think all boarding schools, public schools at that time were curious, and I've written films about them. I've written about them a lot because it's changed since then, and people can hardly believe what happened to us. I mean, because it was so far away, you were there for the full 3 months of term, and there were no half terms because it was too much of a distance to get boys back to London or wherever they lived and back again. So what they would do, they would drive us to a glen somewhere and give us food and tents and come back 3 days later. It was pure Lord of the Flies. It was nobody would do it. Health and safety. And so
no one in a high-vis tabard shepherding around.
Mayhem. So and then, but nothing seriously went wrong. But it was when you think about it, it seemed entirely normal. As you say, these events, like living in a country tearing itself apart in the Civil War, didn't seem abnormal, at that age.
We must come to audience questions in a second. So do think about what you want to ask William, and we'll have a microphone going around. But just before we do that, I feel like just coming back to something earlier. I feel like it'd be a dereliction of journalistic duty if I didn't ask you whether you could tell us something about the third book in the series. Can you give us anything?
Well, I'll give you a scoop in the sense that I've finally come up with a title, which everybody seems to like at the publishing house. So it's going to be called Cold Sunset. Cold War, start with the moon, end with the sun. And in Gabriel's Moon, if those of you who've read it, there's a defection, a sort of triple agent defection. And this particular English spy, a bit like Kim Philby, defects to Moscow. And there's a kind of, again, a conspiracy thing, was Philby a triple agent? I think the answer is no, but it's quite nice to play with that idea that it was a very clever ploy of MI6 to get him to the heart of the KGB apparatus. So I play with that idea. But, of course, Gabriel's very involved in this defection. And in book 3, the spy wants to get out, wants to be exfiltrated.
Okay.
So there's a problem.
Okay. ... to be continued. Yes. Okay. Do people want to stick their hands up, and then there's a mic coming round. There's one right at the back there to start with, and I've clocked these two here as well to follow.
Thank you, William. Despite the BBC's commissioning editor's failings, I'm surprised that Apple TV haven't been knocking on your door after their success with Mick Heron. And I wonder, in your idle moments, do you ever wonder who might be cast as Gabriel Dax or indeed Faith Green?
Well, actually, here's another scoop. The books have been optioned for movies, and I've written the script of Gabriel's Moon. So knock on wood. Let's hope it'll happen. It's the most fickle of businesses, but I know that I don't think this is wishful thinking, but I know that the director, who I won't mention, would really like the actor Josh O'Connor to play Gabriel Dax, which I think is a very smart idea, but, the one you want is the one you never get, so I'm keeping my mind open.
I was going to say, your adventures in the screen trade could probably be a whole other conversation, couldn't it? We haven't touched on that yet.
Yes, I have all the horror stories.
We had a question here at the front. And then...
Thank you both for a really great discussion. It was very enlightening. Mr. Boyd, what made you think that you wanted to be a writer when you were younger? And when did you realise that you probably were a writer?
That's quite a good question, because I think when I was about 16 or 17, as the way you do when you're beginning to contemplate the life ahead of you, your adult life, and what you might do in it, I had the impression that I would never be able to hold down a steady job for some reason, something to do with my temperament. And I wanted to be an artist, and I was quite good at art. I did A-level art at school, and I thought, well, I'll maybe I could go to art school. And I mentioned this to my father, who basically said, "Dream on." And so I thought, well, if I can't be a painter, maybe I could be a novelist. And so I switched my ambitions to literature. Why? I think I'd seen a film, William Holden sitting at a typewriter, typing away, and tearing the page out, going to a drinks table and mixing himself a powerful martini, walking out onto the terrace and looked at all the other people working in the city, and I thought, yes, this is the life for me. But I didn't know any writers, and I didn't know anybody in the publishing world, So it was a process of learning how to bring this ambition about, and it was, it was not. It took many years, in fact. But when I went to university. Well, first of all, when I had a kind of gap year before gap years were invented. And having been 10 years at a boarding school, I said to my father, I have to live a little. And so he said, well, you can if you do something useful. And so I went to the University of Nice in the south of France to do a diploma in French studies. And that's when I started writing little vignettes. So that was the beginning of how do I do this? How do I bring this about? And I went to university in Scotland, Glasgow University, and they, for very enlightened reasons, had a writer in residence. Maybe the first one ever. This is 1971. A now forgotten poet called George Bruce. And George Bruce ran a short story competition for the first year English classes, which are a lot of people, 600 people at the university doing first year English. And I won. So I thought, I'm not kidding myself, and so it built from there on, and I started writing at university. I wrote a novel, I wrote a play, I wrote a lot of student journalism, and then I went to Oxford to do a doctorate, a D.Phil as it's called, and I actually met more writers there, contemporaries like Alan Hollinghurst and A.N. Wilson and Andrew Motion, and as well as people like Iris Murdoch and Brian Aldiss, a science fiction writer, and slowly but surely discovered what you had to do to become a novelist. And here I am. It paid off, but it certainly wasn't overnight.
Thank you. Sorry, yes, in the second row here first. Slide, yeah.
Thank you. I started reading your books. I must be in my 20s, I guess, with Brazzaville Beach and The Ice Cream War, which I thought were completely wonderful. But then you were sort of writing about people your age, and sort of in your sort of time span, even though you're sort of looking back, you aren't looking back nearly as far. How hard is it to kind of go back and look at something sort of, getting on for 60 years ago and put yourself in that place, and also to write about somebody very much younger than you rather than a sort of contemporary?
Well, I think it depends on the kind of writer you are, basically. And I'm not an autobiographical writer. I mean, of course, there's a lot of my autobiography that gets into my novels, but I don't use my life or my circle of friends particularly as raw material. I like to make things up. I like to invent things and use my imagination. And so I think because I'm that type of writer, I can write a novel like Brazzaville Beach from the point of view of a young woman. And, I'm manifestly not a young woman and never was. And I also... I've never killed anybody, you'll be glad to hear, but I have killed people in my novels, and so you just imagine what it must be like, and I think if you do that well, then people believe you. It's a suspension of disbelief. Similarly, when you're writing about somebody who's much older than when I wrote Any Human Heart, I mean, Logan Mount Stewart is in his 80s when he dies, and I was 50 when I wrote that book. So I had to imagine what it was like to be an old man. I mean, I knew lots of old people, but it's always better, rather than asking questions, to imagine what it's like. And somehow, as I said earlier, somehow your well-functioning imagination gets you very close to the actual reality. And so I've never had a problem with that. And similarly, Gabriel Dax is in his early 30s. 40 years younger than me. I wasn't in my 30s in the 60s, but I can imagine what a young, red-blooded young man might feel like then. And similarly with places, there's half the novel takes place in Guatemala. I've yet to visit Guatemala. So I send my imagination, and I do a lot of research, and I have, I know the tricks of the trade to a certain extent now. I know how to find things out and what will be useful to make the research I do really pay off. You can't just sort of chuck it in willy-nilly. It has to be sifted, and you're looking for particular nuggets of information that will do a lot of work for you. So I've got that kind of expertise now, if I've written so many novels. But basically, it's just like trying to imagine what it's like. I don't think I'm giving too much away. Gabriel gets stabbed in the Predicament. I've never been stabbed, but I can imagine what it must be like. And so, as a writer, all your efforts go into making that moment as vivid and as real as possible. And you can do certain amounts of research. You can read books written by people who have been stabbed, but actually it's better to imagine it. In a novel I wrote, New Confessions, a lot of it, the early chapters are set during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, where the central character goes over the top and staggers towards the German lines. And I've seen countless newsreels and read countless books about it, but actually, what you should do is say, how would I feel if I was doing that, aged 21 or something like that? So it's a kind of a mental effort, a mental projection that allows you to occupy situations and places and sexes that you don't seem qualified to do. But I think one of the great liberations about novel writing, or serious novel writing, is you can write about anything, but you just have to be careful, particularly today, because you're going to get judged more severely than you were 30 years ago. But there's nothing to hold you back. You can write about anything you want, I think.
There was just this gentleman in the hat here at the front, and then I can see we've got two more.
Hi, William. Thanks very much for the interview and explanation. I've read that you write your first drafts in longhand. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about your creative process and whether you think writing that first draft in longhand helps with the structure and form of your novel.
Well, it's more complicated than that. I mean, I have a method now which I've evolved, which I rather grandly call the period of invention, followed by the period of composition. And I spend possibly more time figuring out the novel I'm going to write, researching it, blocking out chapters, buying books, making all my mistakes, going up blind alleys, inventing characters that don't live and breathe, before I actually start on page one. And I always have the end of the book in mind before I start writing. I have a destination, and I have sometimes written the last paragraph of the novel before I've written Once Upon a Time on page one. And but it works for me, not for everybody. It works for me. And then, because I'm a pre-computer writer, I always, and I think this applies to a lot of my contemporaries. I know it was true of Martin Amis, and Julian Barnes, and Ian McEwan, because we're all of a similar age. There were typewriters, but we all I think, write our first drafts in longhand. So the great advantage of that is that when you transfer it from the longhand version, the manuscript, into a typescript or on a computer screen, every word is written at least twice. I mean, some words are written 20 times, some sentences are endlessly revised, but the whole book in that process of going from handwriting to typeface means that you think about every single word you've written. And so it's just a method that I've evolved from the very beginning, from that first novel I wrote at university, which I abandoned, or I didn't abandon it, I finished it, but I put it in a bottom drawer, got it out of my system. It's all about me and how fascinating I was.
Do you still have a copy of that somewhere?
I do have a copy of it. It will never see the light of day. But,
the University of Texas in
well, yes,
archive.
Perhaps. But and so it just is it's something I've always done. And actually, the other thing is, talking about University of Texas, I actually have manuscripts of all my novels. I bet no writer under the age of 40 has a manuscript. And manuscripts are fascinating things to study. I spent 8 years at Oxford University failing to write a DPhil thesis on Shelley, but there were suitcases full of his manuscripts. And my only claim to scholarly fame is that I discovered an obscene graffito on the back of a draft of Ode to the West Wind. So he must have been feeling frustrated, I think, that day in Italy. To look at the manuscript of Shelley's poems and then to read the poem to see how it evolved is part of scholarship, but that's going to sort of wither away, I think, now. The hard drive of so-and-so is not quite the same as seeing the handwriting and the crossings out and the second and third thoughts of a manuscript. Yeah. So it's just, to answer your question, just a way of writing that works for me. Other writers like to just start and see how it goes. If day by day they get the right sort of inspiration. But what if you don't? I think, that's what worries me. That's why I've evolved this. What if the muse decides not to descend that day? What do you do? Go to the pub, or put your novel aside. I think that's how novels get abandoned. But I've never abandoned a novel because I have this particular method of writing, of figuring it all out before I start.
We had a question here.
Hi, thank you so much. I've read both the novels, and I thought what was very interesting about them is they're obviously very exciting and around the world of espionage and MI5 and spying, but they're also, I'd say, have a critical lens of the role of the Secret Service in this historical period as well. And I was curious as to whether you feel like that you have more responsibility as a novelist writing about these time periods now that we know more about the consequences of things like the coup in Guatemala or what happened to Lumumba in this sort of more contemporary form.
Well, I think that you do have a responsibility to tell the truth as you see it, but in a way, I think it was John le Carré who kind of opened that door. That there was a feeling that we were the good guys and the Soviets were the bad guys, but in actual fact, we could be just as bad as they were. And that's what le Carré's revolution, I think, in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold achieved. Or to give due credit to Len Deighton, who published 3 extraordinary novels, spy novels in the 1960s, The Ipcress File, Funeral in Berlin, Horse Underwater. Similarly, took the lid off that sort of clubland version of espionage and showed that we were as capable of dirty tricks as anybody else. So in a way, that licenses me or any other person writing a spy novel to tell the truth, however ugly it is. And so I think, I didn't make anything up about the coup in Guatemala. There was another assassination before that of a president, again authorized by Eisenhower. And it's almost a blueprint of Dallas in that a lone gunman shot the president and then shot himself, with a note confessing. So the dirty tricks have been around for a long time, and I think it's naive to assume it's something that novelists have invented. It was going on. So I think tell the truth as far as you understand it. And again, it comes out about you don't need to feel apologetic or have to somehow sweeten the pill by making out that things weren't as bad as they were.
We've got several hands up. How many questions have we got time for, Lily? About one. About one. Should we have this person in the front row here?
Hi, thank you. It's been fascinating. I just want to ask you something completely different, actually, which is thinking about other influences on you. So on novels like Love is Blind, you obviously talk that, there's so much music in that, and I just wondered, of all the other arts, which things might influence you, whether it's visual arts or whether it's going to the theatre or whether it's film, or I'd be quite interested to understand if any of those other areas influence some of your writing, especially
I think I'm culture vulture like most people, and I consume and all sorts of art forms. I go to art galleries, go to the theatre. I've written plays. I go to movies. I listen to all types of music, and so that's part of the cultural mulch out of which I come. But I think that if there is an influence, and it's not surprising to say it's other novels rather than a painting or a symphony by Brahms or something like that. It's other novels that you've read, probably before you decided to become a novelist, that had an impact on you. And I remember very vividly reading Graham Greene's novel Heart of the Matter when I was 15 or 16, and it's a World War II sort of a spy novel, but it's set in Sierra Leone in West Africa, and I'd been to Sierra Leone, and it's just along the coast from Ghana where I was born and raised. And I remember thinking, this is just like the world I live in, because it's talking about the weather and the heat and the roads, and I suddenly saw then that you could take the elements of your own life and turn them into a fiction. And there are other books I read when I was younger, where I read Catch-22 by Joseph Heller on a plane flying out to Nigeria, which was undergoing a crazy civil war. And I thought Catch-22 is possibly the greatest novel ever written because it's weird and surreal and somehow made an odd kind of sense of the world that I was about to enter in Nigeria. So I think if there's, and it's all grist to the mill, but it's other novels that you liked or responded to that trigger that urge to write something a bit like it. I'm a great admirer of Evelyn Waugh, strange man, but his humour is extraordinary because it's so dark and so ruthless, and I responded to that intuitively. But I think the comic novels I've written are the same in a way, because it's the same kind of ruthless, no-holds-barred humour. So I think that, to answer your question, it's other novels I've read that have led me down particular paths. Chekhov, massive influence. Chekhov's short stories, not so much his plays. So you recognise these people you respond to. You don't necessarily imitate them, but there's something about their worldview that chimes with yours and encourages you to try to write your own work of art that does the same thing as their works of art do.
Thank you. I'm afraid our time is up. This hugely enjoyable novel, The Predicament, if you don't already have a copy, you can buy a copy from the bookselling desk at the back there. If you do already have a copy, it makes an excellent Christmas present, and Christmas present buying season is upon us, as I'm sure you'll all appreciate. William, I hope you will come back in a year's time to talk to us about Cold Sunset.
Yes, with pleasure.
That's an open invitation, which, unlike the BBC, I won't rescind. Thank you all for coming out this evening or for tuning in online, and please join me in thanking our Observer Book Club guest, William Boyd.
The Observer.